Grace, can I just launch in? Or?
Yeah, so this is Shelley Reed. She's a Boston-based artist. Did all the paintings in this exhibit entitled Dubious Battle, which is specifically the painting that's behind us. That's a 47-foot-long painting. Shelley was trained as a colorist, but as you can see, does not use color in her present-day work, but rather focuses on tonal qualities of black and white. The animals often stand in for humans to talk about our winnings and failings
You're giving it all away.
within our society. And with that, I will turn it over to you, in which you can elaborate, and we're really excited to have you here.
Thank you, Grace. Thank you. Can I ask all the docents to just raise their hands because I'm confused now with students? Great. Okay. So I just really want to thank the docents for what you do, because I think what you do really helps when people look at the work to understand it even a little bit more, which I think is really just an incredibly valuable thing to do. So I came to painting kind of late, and I actually studied psychology and then worked for a little while, and then decided I really needed to give painting. And I had always been drawing, so lots of monochromatic use of materials for a long time. When I got to art school, I just jumped into painting, really, really loved it. I was trained, as Grace said, as a colorist. I used tons and tons of color splashed around. I loved it. I love color in paintings, and my home is full of color. But I started to feel that color was very seductive, and that when we think about art, one of the first things that people think about is color, and they expect color when they come to art. And I think very often that can sort of stop you. When you see a really beautifully colored painting, that's what you take away from it. And I wanted to do something that was a little bit different. And I was living in England, and I was looking a lot at fabulous old work in museums. And I was trying to figure out what to paint, and looking at this old work, and I started to realize that painters who were working 300 or 400 years ago were painting stuff that I felt was still relevant today. In a way, other than just enjoying the art in the museum, I felt that some of the content that was in their work was relevant to issues that are still happening today. So I started taking small details out of our art history, little tiny details, and blowing them up, making them much, much larger, sort of making them the real focal point of a painting. And that became the premise for my body of work for about 30 years. It's basically a mashup of art history. I spent many, many hours before the internet. It used to be being in the stacks of libraries, looking through old books of art history to try to find paintings that felt, or images that felt interesting to me for one reason or another. And actually, animals came up a little bit later for me, except fully that they're images from art history, and that's what I ended up focusing on. But I change all the paintings a little bit, like in the line Caught in a Net. That actually is by an artist named Franz Snyder, working in the late 1500s to early 1600s. And the original painting is a little bit longer. On the left-hand side, the net is shown, and there's a little mouse sitting on the net. So the concept by the original artist was the fable about how something very, very small can actually help something much larger than itself, right? And then a partnership can be joined. But so the idea of fable, the idea of teaching stories, passing down knowledge, that was the idea for that original painting. And I knocked that out to sort of make an open-ended narrative. Something that really interests me in painting is allowing the viewer to come up with their own questions and answers, allowing the viewer to come up with their own idea of what might be happening in a story. So when I come up with a painting, I'm obviously thinking about certain messages that I'd like to impart, but I'm also sort of more interested in allowing the viewer to come up with their own, possible storylines. So starting from these littler paintings, building up to a much, much bigger, almost immersive landscape. I was interested in theater. I wanted to make something that you can almost enter the environment one-on-one, and stand in an environment, and wherever you look, something is happening. And again, it could be something that's aggressive, or something that's inviting, something that's a little more pastoral, so oriented towards beauty and gardens, or something a little more violent and wild-oriented. So in Dubious Battle is a line from Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost, and it basically references sort of an epic battle between Satan and God. It's also, in Dubious Battle, has been used for different things. John Steinbeck used it as a title of his book, which dealt with the unions. And so it's been used in a lot of different ways. For me, and it's hard to say this without sounding simplistic, but sometimes simple things are very true. For me, it's all of that, but it's also the idea that we as people are, we have such tremendous potential to do really wonderful things, and we have done wonderful things, but we also have tremendous potential to do the opposite. And my parents were Holocaust survivors, so that's sort of wrapped in there. So while I try to be very optimistic about our moving forward, there's also a sense of worry, and that's sort of incorporated in this. So art history, very, very important. I sort of put aside the idea of originality in art, which was very important in the 20th century, especially when I was in art school in the early 80s. And I just decided that there's such a vast pool that came before us that people are sort of forgetting a little bit, that I wanted to reintroduce in a slightly new way. So this is basically a mashup of art history, and when I say mashup, I really mean that. A good example of that is the horse. The head of the horse is taken from one artist, the body from another. There are many elements in here that are pretty solidly from one artist, but then lots of other things are thrown in. So this section here is pretty solidly from one artist, but there are some changes. In the original painting, the dogs are actually chained together. I broke them out of that. In that part of the painting there with the lion and the dog that it's hugging and fighting with is part of one painting, but every other dog around it is taken from another painter and different painters from the same time. So what was interesting to me is that painters from the same period of time are looking at each other. And that's for docents, this is a really important thing for me in the work. People who are working during a period of time often referenced each other very, very directly. In fact, I'm sure there are some pretty good examples. So this painting here, which is called Bird Concert, I have after Irwin. So I always, that's a really important thing for me too, for the docents. I always attribute the paintings to the original artist. So after my title, there's always a parenthetical attribution, because it's important for me, for people to know that they come from art history. So this one, I have after Irwin, but it's because when I first saw that image over 10 years ago, in an old art book that I found, a tiny little black and white image, that's what it said. It was a print, not a painting, it was a print, and it said, by Richard Irwin. Well, it turned out, and I only found this out later on, that Franz Snyders, who was about 100 years before Irwin, painted this painting. And the painting was so popular that several engravers, for hundreds of years after, did an engraving of that. And Irwin was actually, I think, the third engraver who did an image of this painting. So really, this painting should be called Bird Concert after, and then there would be a lineage. And that lineage is actually really important to me as well. I feel that I'm in a lineage, as most artists are, of what came before. So there is this layer of art history that is really important to me, but a really important thing is that someone can hopefully enjoy the work without knowing any of that. And that's part of the use of animals. They're sort of a universal language. People bring a lot of their own feelings towards animals. They're obviously metaphors for humans. But, oh, I lost my train of thought. What was it? Anyway, that idea that,
People don't have to know art history.
Thank you. That's right. Thank you so much. So the first way to enjoy a piece of art, hopefully, is visually. Just the visual, dramatic power, engagement, and then once you start to understand other levels, and it's the same with Rachel's work, right? And Ai Weiwei's work. In fact, the zodiac heads that are out there, once you understand where they come from, where he originally took them from, it's a totally different way to understand the work. But hopefully that's additive. Hopefully the first step is the work has power in and of itself, and then the more that you learn about it, the more interesting it can become. So while I'm on that one, I'm just going to pick out a couple of things again for the docents, because this is kind of fun stuff. So bird concerts. Back then, a lot of these animals, not all of them, and I don't know all the symbology, I do know some of it, a lot of animals represented certain human characteristics back then, as they still do today, but it was even a bigger language back then. So the peacock, vanity, the owl, wisdom, and in this painting, you have this tiny little owl who's really the conductor. If you look closely, there's a little score there. Trying to control this cacophony of huge birds who, hopefully they will join together and be able to make some beautiful music, but we don't really know. That's the open-ended narrative. And that's also, I feel, how we do as humans. Hopefully we'll be able to pull it together and work together and make for some really beautiful stuff, but it's open-ended. And a fun thing, for the docents in there, is that right underneath this big, whether it's a heron or an egret, is a little bat. So back then, they really didn't even know whether, they thought that bats were birds. So that's also a really interesting thing to me, is how knowledge was being disseminated at that time from different parts of the world. Animals would be brought that were very exotic, that people hadn't seen before. So people would, an artist would make a drawing of an animal that wasn't really widely known, and then other artists would copy that and use that in their work. So you'll often see a picture of a giraffe that, that someone made a sketch of, and then you'll see that giraffe, if you study art history, in many different paintings by painters at that time. So how fascinating is that, right, before the internet? I just found that really, it's an important piece for me. Predator-prey, these circles here, we bring a lot of assumptions to animals and what, what their stature is and the pecking order. But in the original paintings, it's different than what your assumptions might be. Like the wolf in the lower right-hand corner, who's looking pretty aggressive. In the original painting that it's taken from, it's actually caught in a pretty horrible leg trap, with broken leg and everything, and howling in pain rather than in aggression. The swan in the original painting has wings fully spread. I mean, it's a huge span of wings, protecting its nest of eggs from, I think, a dog. And that dog it looks like it's going to be running away in fear. So, breaking assumptions, open-ended narrative, that kind of thing. Okay, in Dubious Battle. Well, I'm starting from something a little bit more pastoral, always a reference to humans. So in a lot of my paintings, there's, architecture, but the architecture could be crumbling. There's a, half-drunk glass of wine. So there's always the suggestion of people, but really overt absence as well. And the animals, obviously, somewhat kind of stand-in for people, sometimes getting along, sometimes not. Species of the same cat. And again, that question mark. So right in the far right-hand corner, at the very last minute, when I was making the painting, I added the bunny. So, which actually was a really important addition for me, because the idea of the bunny, I'm sorry? The rabbit. See the little rabbit right there? And a lot of people don't even see the rabbit. So the rabbit, and it became important for me because that corner of the painting, which is, very aggressive and violent, that rabbit was that element of hope, right? That rabbit, the dogs could, but also questioning. The dogs could be protecting the rabbit. The dogs could be protecting the rabbit because they wanted for lunch. It's sort of unclear. And I should have said this at the beginning. Questions just jump in any time, so I will say that now. Any questions? I would love to take.
What are you working on right now?
I'm working on this painting. When I started this, the idea was going to be that it would just continue around the whole room. And actually, and again, this is important for docents, I spent many years doing paintings like these two, or these three, individual images, usually with a strong central focus. And then I started to realize that I really wanted to expand the picture. I wanted to expand the landscape. That's how this came about. And with this painting, why stop? Right, so the idea originally was to take it around the room, but I had a show coming up, and it went into the show. So what's interesting to me is the way to stop making individual paintings, but to make a more interactive painting where you can see it's painted kind of in sections, where you could pull out a section and pull the painting back together and make a new landscape. And in fact, you can see there are elements like here, the architecture doesn't fit exactly right. That would be much wider, like this one. There are lots here, right? There are lots, if you look in almost every place where there's a break here, these boulders here, they wouldn't just be behind a tree, right? They would be. So there are sections like that all over. Fragments, connections. So the idea of that is it brings up the idea of time. When is this happening? How is it? Is it actually one complete landscape? Is it a landscape on different days? And playing with that idea of action. So continuing what I'm doing, but trying to think of it in bigger ways. And actually the idea of the little paintings, also for me at some point, like the Edwin Landseer over there, the stag, I enjoyed doing portraits, just little portraits of a single quiet, subject. But I sometimes think of them as players in the larger, larger idea that I have going on. So both focusing on the individual and then how the individuals interact when they're thrown into the melting pot.
I love how it reminds me of the dream time as well.
I'm sorry?
You just kind of reinforced I was thinking about dream time. You're talking about time, and we're talking about time out here, but when you're telling, I had this amazing dream last night, and this is like this flow, this cinematic dream, but things don't quite match up, and you're like, and then I was in this building, and then just go with me here, but I was in a field. Just go with me here. And then there's this rabbit and the dog and the lion. I'm not sure if the dogs and the lion were, so it's just mesmerizing, and how your work is wonderful and just pulls you in, but has that dreamlike sense of, wow, how is this come to be? But don't think that, just go with it.
Right, that's great. And that actually, if these were all in color, I feel like that you wouldn't even really be able to go there in a way, because if they're black and white, they're kind of an echo of art history. They're a little bit cooler. If these were in color, it'd be like, they would be screaming. They'd be screaming, they'd be screaming beauty, ugliness, blood, that kind of thing. But because they're black and white, they're a little bit more misty, and also the idea that a lot of how animals use color, how color is meant on them, is an element of camouflage, right? So removing that was very interesting to me as well. What are you left with once the camouflage is gone? And it's kind of the interactions. Please.
Comment, I love the bird, because it looks like there's the line, and you look at the bird, and it looks like a floating bird, and you see
That's great. Actually, I have an early painting of a swan, and it's a beautiful swan, and it was in a landscape it was in a Dutch still life of a lot of dead animals. And at that point, I really could barely even look at a picture of an animal who was, in any way in a violent situation. So what I did was, I took the head off of the swan, I turned it over, and the painting is a large painting of a swan, like in mid-flap and mid-air. You don't see the head, but you see the whole body, and it looks very, very alive. It took me a long time to be able to actually look at an image like this, and then I realized that needs to be painted, right? I need to be able to throw that into, but you can see that if you turn this upside down, gave it a longer neck, it would actually look, mid-flight almost. But then I realized that really wasn't what it was about for me. It was more about, well, what, as metaphors for people, how do we deal with this, right? How do we deal with that more animal instinct?
Could you describe on how you work physically?
Yeah, great question, great question. So, painfully. So something that's really important to me, and this has to do with using art history too, is that today we have all this amazing technology, right? And there's kind of no reason to do this. I mean, you walk into many museums. In fact, the museum I had a show at, they did this huge banner. I mean, it was huge, a reproduction of my work hanging on the building. So with that kind of ability to reproduce things, there's something very compelling to me about the idea of one person making something by hand on a really, really large scale. So what I do is I'm in my studio, which is not nearly this big, so the painting is, in a U shape or even all the way around all four walls. And I'm up on a ladder. I'm down on the floor. I put the painting up as high as I can, but I have to work around the painting as much as possible. So there's a lot of labor involved, and usually I'm up at the painting like this. I mean, the painting is here, and I'm 8 inches away from it. The biggest brush I use is maybe 1.5 inches, except for the skies. Sometimes for the skies I'll use a 4 or 5 inch brush, so it's ridiculously labor intensive. But, it kind of has to be. And that I use small brushes, I very intentionally don't make everything tight. So there's some loose painting, there's some tight painting, but it's all by hand. And I start, sometimes you'll be able to see, I think there's somewhere in here, you'll see a little bit of a brown or a rust tone. I start with a very loose drawing in a raw sienna or a burnt umber, which is a very, very traditional thing. Actually, Rembrandt would tone the panels with a raw sienna or an umber. And the idea of that was that all future layers that you put on top would have that similar tone underneath, and it would unify the painting. Also, it meant that some areas of the painting you wouldn't actually have to put paint on, that would be the color. And that brings me to something else. I wanted to bring up a point about Caught in a Net, which is by Snyder's again. So Snyder's was one of the earliest animaliers. It's painters who started to do realistic representations of animals, because before that, earlier than the 1500s, animals were not really painted in their natural environment. They were used for different reasons in art. So he was one of the earliest ones to do that, and he became so good at it that people like Peter Paul Rubens, who everyone probably knows some of his work, would use him as the painter of the animals in his paintings. So back then, when you look at other artists, big artists like Rubens, there were often other artists. You know, everyone knows that the big artists had assistants who did a lot of their painting. But there were artists who became very well known for specific things that, they would often do different elements, like Audubon's. Very often Audubon would do the bird, but other people would do the landscapes in those paintings. So that, at a point in time when painting was thought about a little bit differently, originality was thought about very differently. Okay.
Shelley, you asked me to remind you about photography.
Photography. Well, actually, thank you for doing that. So that I just kind of addressed the idea that painters of that period, they'd come up like attacked by hounds. A pretty realistic depiction of a deer before photography, before any reproductive technology existed, they were really just using their eye. And, I'm so impressed with that, considering what we do today. So that makes me think a lot about art as we move forward, which is really interesting. There has always been this adage for the last 100 years that painting is dead, which of course it always gets, it always says, oh no, it's not in the art world, and then, oh yes it is. So it's this, especially in the New York art world. And right now painting is actually having a thriving, afterlife. But that's going to be I think something that comes up over and over again. I think it's basically established itself now as a long-lasting art form, but it is interesting to see how that's going to be affected as our technology and our reproductive technology for art moves forward. Bob?
Yes. The horse. I have a great deal of affection and respect for George Catlin. And he wasn't a trained artist, but his portraits were accomplished because he had some training in that area. But his animals were so distinctive. And his bison, I saw much more accomplished artists come up with the same bisons, even though he was there earlier, and the horse, the same thing. The heads were so distinctive. And when I saw that, I just had a good, nice feeling.
Oh, that's great.
Because I admired him so much for what he did and his concern for the Native American.
That's wonderful. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Any other photographers? Any connection to
Some of these guys they're art majors too. So,
Oh, really?
and they've taken painting classes.
Okay. So I'm going to say something to you guys specifically about that. Some of the artists that I referenced were considered a Picasso of their day, and totally lost to us. Well, not totally. Our historians know who they are. Their work is in museums, so you can see them. Gesundheit. But, we sort of use the people who were earlier. We use those Picassos of the day, and the artists who come right after them incorporate what they've done into their work, change it a little bit, incorporate it, but then move on. So you end up losing, one of the people that I use very often is Melchior de Hundegutta, and he was, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, he was the preeminent painter of birds during his lifetime. Commissions left and right, often back then, wealthy people would often get exotic birds for their, courtyards, just as a status symbol. He would be called in to paint those birds over and over and over again. Now, he's making a comeback now, but for centuries, no one really knew about him. So that idea of what becomes very special in a moment, contextually, because what we need as a society, then gets lost, but then comes back. So what does that mean about us, our development, right, as a species, in terms of what we need societally and moving? So the last thing I will say, really, is that is the ultimate message for me, is what is our evolution? How can we be hopeful about our evolution? What can we learn from what we've done in the past? And that's a big part of, fear, invitation, beauty, aggression.